panel on the covenant in modern Jewish thought. I'm honored to chair this panel and being part of this wonderful conference. I want to read you a few lines about the covenant and it's the difference between a contract and a covenant in Rabbi Sachs' words. Just a disclaimer, Rabbi Sachs and Lior Sachs Shmueli are not relatives, okay? We may in our roots, but not that I know of. In a contract, two or more people come together, each pursuing their self-interest to make a mutually advantageous exchange. In a covenant, two or more people, each respecting the dignity and integrity of the other, come together in a bond of loyalty and trust to do together what neither can achieve alone. It isn't an exchange, it's a moral commitment. It is more like a marriage than a commercial transaction. Contracts are about interests. Covenants are about identity. Contracts benefit. Covenants transform. Contracts are about me and you. Covenants are about us. So I find these words inspiring for our exciting panel, and I'm honored to invite Professor Alan Brill, is the Koperman, Russ, and Dole Chair in the Jewish Christian Studies Graduate Program in the Department of Religion at Seton University. He specialized in interfaith theology, mysticism, and comparative theology. Brill is the author of several books, including Rabbi on the Ganges, a Jewish-Hindu encounter based on his time as based on his time as a Fulbright Senior Scholar Award at Banaras Hindu University in India. He's currently working on a book on a Jewish view of religious diversity and was a keynote speaker at the recent R20 summit in Bali. So Professor Alan Brill is going to speak about the dignity of globalization. Please.
I know a wonderful Muslim interfaith organizer in Singapore who makes motivational posters and Facebook posts with quotes from Rabbi Sachs' Dignity of Difference. Singapore uses interfaith in order to create social cohesion between the 10 main religions of Singapore, including Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, Confucianism. My Muslim friend Fahima finds Rabbi Sachs directly addressing the social cohesion needs of Singapore in this age of globalization. This paper is called The Dignity of Globalization, but could just as well be called Diversity in Globalization. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, as chief rabbi, was invited to world forums on economics, the environment, education, globalization. These conferences, such as at that time the G7 summit, the Davos conference, were meetings of world thought leaders seeking to give direction to political leadership. At the time, Rabbi Sachs was a master of the form, advocating in his speeches for a moral climate to be created because free markets are not moral and the goal of profits does not lead to responsibility or human dignity. The book, Dignity of Difference, grew out of those talks. Much attention has been given to Rabbi Sachs' view of interfaith in Chapter 3 of Dignity of Difference. However, less attention has been given to the rest of the book, chapters 4 through 10, which explain how these interfaith views are embedded in a broader, more robust theory of globalization, of which interfaith is only one element in his much bigger speeches. There's a dignity of globalization, and globalization needs diversity of religions. Now, this talk will not just be based on the book Dignity of Difference, but also on many of the earlier and later drafts of those same talks that were given, such as the 2003 paper Global Covenant, A Jewish Perspective of Globalization, or the prior 2000 Markets, Governments, and Virtues. You see that he's giving alternate formulations and tweaking it in all directions in each time he gets up in public. In the years 1998 to 2004, the issues were globalization and capitalism. Samuel Huntington at that point was an advocate of the clash of civilizations, while Sachs followed Thomas Friedman, who wrote at that point the Lexus and the Olive Tree, and Benjamin Barber, Jihad versus McWorld, who believed in the power of the market to temper the clash. On the issues of capitalism, Sachs used the critics of unchecked capitalism, such as Naomi Klein's No Logos, George Soros's Open Society, many works of Michael Walzer, and Zygmunt Bauman on globalization. In many of these positions, Sachs was close to his contemporary and friend, Prime Minister Tony Blair, who converted to Catholicism upon leaving office, and set up an organization specifically for solving global problems as part of an interfaith program. In his writings, 1996 to 2004, Sachs envisioned a globalization of Jewish concerns on economics, communications, travel, environment, education, healthcare. Now, we've all mentioned how much he's influenced by communitarian thought, because for Sachs, the covenant in our age of globalization is to recognize there are many covenants. And therefore, he writes, religions teach us to look beyond the tribe and nation and towards a universal God of justice, righteousness, peace, and human dignity. And therefore, that's what he thought all religions do. And in some way, he sees interfaith as really made up of these many covenants that solve the world's problems. And in some way, this is the thesis of the paper in a nutshell. Religion solves social problems, not the secular state. And his interfaith idea of diversity grew out of this ethical insight that's being told in a room in which there are 6, 8, or 10 different religions all getting up on panels speaking about the same topics. Now, besides the communitarian critiques of Walzer, Putnam, and others, Sachs was influenced at the turn of the millennium's third way economics of Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, and Pope John Paul II, seeking to balance free market with social concern. And he said that the answer is not government action or the working of the markets. For Sachs, the answer is the third sector, the domain of families, congregations, communities, neighborhood groups, and voluntary organizations, which are all bigger than the individual and smaller than the state. Now, before I turn to big negative difference, I want to go back to some of his antecedents. So I must point out, because it's going to play a role in his language of these talks, Alistair McIntyre's idea of human flourishing and after virtue is that we have a narrative view of our human life which links birth to life, middle to end, and we look to these narratives in order to discriminate between particular practices and goods, in order to ask, what is the good of my life? And one can only know this by being part of a living tradition that is historically extended. Very Sachs-sounding. But 20 years later, Tony Blair developed his foreign policy through the concept of an international community, a recast of domestic ideas of the family, local community, and emphasized the interdependence of many nations in a community of nations based on the domestic interrelationship between persons and community. Blair focused on the idea of global community created like a tapestry in which different nations and different religions could share common values like equal worth of humanity. Sachs was certainly influenced by his fellow conference speaker, Tony Blair. But I must digress for a moment and explain to you how speeches at someplace like Davos or the G20 come to be. This past year, I had the privilege of being a keynote speaker at this year's R20 Summit, part of the G20 Summit. And even though I am far from as eloquent or as learned as Rabbi Sachs by any means, but in the process, I saw how my talk came with a clear invitation letter of what I was supposed to speak on. There was a clear conceptual organization of what the program wanted to achieve in the final communique before any of us started speaking. And it went through 3 drafts until the staff made sure all the proper buzzwords of the conference was in it. And after we gave our talks, they made sure our talks was integrated, so there are now a whole bunch of Hindu and Muslim papers that have a footnote to my paper because they made sure we were all integrated to each other. Rabbi Sacks's public papers on these topics show the same integration and certainly are now integrated within the people like Bill Clinton as part of his footnotes, as part of the editing process. One other thing I must get to before coming back to dignity of difference is his love for Anglicanism. And that could be its own paper in its own right. But Chief Rabbi Sacks was the sole Jewish defense against the ending of Anglicanism as the established Church of England. And I'm going to quote from his document that he submitted to the House of Lords about why you should keep Anglicanism as the established church. A covenant, meaning the Anglican covenant, is not a yes-no way of partitioning reality. It is not a matter of a right-wrong preposition with one side being erased by the other. It is possible to enter a covenant without erasing the other. A covenant is predicated on difference. Cooperation is the nature of covenant. A covenant brings radically different people and entities together. Husband, wife, parent, child, man, and God. Ultimately, God and humanity, through love and trust, face the future together. If we were all the same, we would not need a covenant. And for Rabbi Sacks already, interfaith comes from a belief in covenants. Now returning to the dignity of difference. On the topic of globalization, Sacks connects many of the contemporary issues directly to biblical stories, and I'll leave that for the speakers tomorrow. So, for example, he starts off the first age of globalization were the Phoenicians who would do their trade around the world. Sacks say there are many positive changes of globalization, but many negative ones, and deeply threatening to traditional cultures. But for Sacks, and he writes, religions teach us to look beyond the tribe and the nation to the universal God of justice, righteousness, peace, and human dignity. And Judaism is one of those universal voices. Not the only one, but one of them. The prophets of ancient Israel were the first to think globally, to think of humanity as a single moral community linked by a covenant of mutual responsibility. And for him, all religions endow life with human dignity. They give us freedom, volition, and choice to make the world a better place. They allow us to dream, have hope for a better tomorrow. Religions teach us a moral view so that we use technology and globalization for good and not for bad. He never directly addresses the parts of religion or even of Judaism that don't increase human dignity, nor does he ever write response to undirect texts, which is a separate story. In the age of globalization, he also talks about we need education, and that education comes from the fact that God endowed human beings to be in his image, and therefore to have creativity, to be a partner in creation, and that's about education. And of course, Judaism, both biblical and rabbinic, believes in education, a democratization of education, and therefore it's our duty as Jews in the age of globalization to ensure education for all, and that everyone on earth have access to information, knowledge, and skills. And at that point, he footnotes as his source President Bill Clinton and George Soros. I mean, there's a coming together of what he truly sees as the Jewish point of view and what goes on at these conferences about what the agenda is. On civil society, he points out that modernity valued progress over everything else, but this led to an impoverished social world. He quotes along the way his 1999 book, The Politics of Hope, where he talks about the covenantal, and that's more important than the contractual, that we should have a world and a civil society based on love, loyalty, faithfulness, mutuality. And he certainly points out the Judaic emphasis on the third sector of family, synagogue, and school is an essential thing that Judaism has to teach to the world. These conferences also talked about global relief, which he immediately translates as tzedakah. But he defines it as the removal of barriers to human dignity, which includes the removal of poverty, tyranny, structural economics, and structural social deprivation. Meaning, Sachs will use the definition of Amartya Sen, the Indian economist, in order to define Stucca, but Sen is a committed secularist who wants to solve the problems through government amelioration, while Sachs thinks it's going to be handled through a covenant. And a covenant because you remember you were slaves in Egypt, and therefore do not oppress the widow, orphan, or stranger. But he made a huge jump there to take Stucca and apply it to structural economic problems. He clearly holds in these speeches that the market by itself is unfair, unequitable, and therefore Stucca is the concept for our times, and that the retreat from the welfare state and the financial deregulations and monetarist policy set in progress by Reaganomics and Thatcherism have created great inequalities in the world. Remember, he's speaking around circa 2000 of what was seen as the general agenda at the time. And he writes, third world workers produce the goods the multinationals sell, do so under Dickinsonian conditions that involves child labor, unsanitary factories, less than subsistence wages, and he's going to solve it by saying we've got to cultivate compassion, social justice, human solidarity on a global level. Now, he actually takes the Rambam in Hilchot Stucca that says the goal is to give people economic self-sufficiency, and he applies it to foreign affairs. Now, you should know there's an article by Michael Walzer in Foreign Affairs that actually does that and takes the Rambam and applies it to relief. I don't know if Sachs saw that article, but a lot of what he's doing is that same move of globalizing halachic statements, and this may be one of Sachs's major contributions to the history of Jewish ethics, is to extend local ethics to a global level. On many issues, he was the first Orthodox rabbi to make a leap into a global imperative. On environment, he's going to once again talk about the need to preserve the environment. Or in 2022, we all now have to use the word climate change or stop using plastics. But in the year 2000, the word was environment. And he concludes that, says, many of the world's great faiths contain teachings of great wisdom on environmental ethics. He's coming from the world of globalization, not from environmental theology. Now to return to the dignity of difference. Now, while the first edition of Dignity of Difference mentioned is one universal God, but each religion has its own particular covenant with God, and that got censored in the second edition, but he didn't ever retreat. In the essays that came out in 2003, 2004, he even goes much further and writes, God has spoken in many languages through many faiths. No language need threaten the others. None should supersede the others. Religious truth is not solely ontological, but covenantal. Ontologies conflict, covenants do not. And ostensibly, he went out on a ledge and progressively much further by removing ontology from the question and saying that it's all about narrative. He says diversity of religions in the hands of the later talks become diversity of narratives that guide us. And therefore, he's much closer to McIntyre and Tony Blair in the way he formulates it as he's going on. Sachs is aware that many see religion as part of the problem, but he is adamant that religion is a moral covenant that gives us a sense of responsibility. Sachs advocates creating a global covenant to work for human rights, human dignity, and the common good. He does not want a political entity such as the United Nations, but a covenantal agreement in many ways, similar to the original documents on human rights collected by Eleanor Roosevelt, in which Hindu, Muslim, Confucian scholars all said, we don't have concepts of Western human rights. We have religious versions that provide compassion, human dignity, but we don't have to agree in theory. Sachs, in many ways, goes along with that sort of Eleanor Roosevelt edited volume. Finally, I want to point out that in all of these talks, he's referring to Torah. He's referring to the religious ideals of Judaism. At no point did it ever get activated or played out in anything called a Jewish state or a state of Israel. It is entirely about the wisdom of the Jewish religion. Sachs extolled the power of interfaith difference as shown and how he gathered with representatives of many faiths to offer solace, give advice, and try to work together to make the global world a better place. He recounts, and this I conclude, how at one memorial event to the victims of 9/11, he says, the Archbishop of Canterbury said a prayer. So did a Muslim imam. A Hindu guru from India recited a meditation and sprinkled rose petals on the site. The chief rabbi of Israel read a reflection he had written for the occasion. It was a rare moment of togetherness in the face of mankind's awesome powers of destruction. This entire sentiment of togetherness, as opposed to the force of destruction, embodies his general approach to advocate for the acceptance of other faiths and to respect other religious paths, and that interfaith is good as many covenants in our age of globalization.